Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Michelle Bilek. She is very involved in what's going on in Mississauga and Peel in regards to housing and food insecurity. And there's a debate coming up this week at one of the food banks, and I thought it would be really good to check in with Michelle on some of the issues that probably will come up and some of the issues that she's seen. Michelle Bilek, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Brian. Glad to be here.
So, Michelle, I've heard statistics that are frankly pretty astounding that food bank usage is gone up dramatically. And, our unemployment rate is low. We think about Mississauga and Brampton and Peel as prosperous communities. Why is food bank usage up so dramatically?
I would say the primary reason for that is, well, the core reason I think for various forms of insecurity is the housing crisis. I think that food insecurity has always been intrinsically linked to the unaffordable market and basically a divestment in affordable, accessible, and appropriate housing for since pretty much the 80s, I would have to say.
So I've been told that food bank usage goes up dramatically right near the end of the month, and so it's when people need to make the rent payment, they choose to pay their rent rather than to buy food for their families.
Yep, that would probably
really
be an accurate statistic. Yeah.
Is that the truth? That people are so stretched because of housing and affordability that they have to go to a food bank, maybe all the time, but maybe just 1 week a month so that they can make ends meet.
Yeah, I would, what's really interesting that I found when I visit I remember the food banks used to be when I volunteered. Actually, I think the last time I volunteered for Eden Food for Change, which is part of the Mississauga Food Bank chain, was about 2.5 years ago, and I was actually quite surprised many of them are open every day of the week. Before it used to be, okay, well, a certain caption area open in the evening at a certain amount of time and a certain day. Now most of the food banks are open every day of the week for most of the day, I would have to say. So it's almost like a full-time. It's a full-time almost, I would say, service, so people are pretty much lining up most of the time. I would have to say to come in and. Back in the day too, it used to be, okay, well, an individual could come once a month, and now it's gotten to the point where food insecurity is, it's an ongoing issue. People frequent the food bank multiple times, sometimes a month, and it is, I would have to say, if you ask any of the individuals and usually when you go into a food bank, there's some counseling, there's additional services there for folks that they need, whether that be employment services, support for social assistance, so housing supports. Like there's usually, food banks have become sort of like this social hub for people, right? And so you ask them, and most of them are working poor people.
Working poor. So they're not people that are unemployed. They're working poor.
Yeah, most of them are working poor people. Yep. Or striving to get a job, just looking. And then again, during this by-election cycle, and we have a tremendous amount of knowledge that many of our shelter systems, we've had an influx of refugees and asylum seekers that we've taken in, and those folks also visit the food bank once they're probably established in some sort of form of housing for a while, and until they see their income go from maybe a stagnant employment to something more secure too. So working poor families are visiting the food bank on a normal basis nowadays.
This has been going on for decades. I've lived in Mississauga for 24 years, and I've heard about and gone to charitable events, raising money or raising food for food banks the whole time. Why is it never ending?
Yeah. Well, again, I think access to food, access to good food, it's almost like the last thought on an individual's mind, right? Caring for your child, the needs of your children and your family, and keeping a roof over your head is your priority, right? And if you're scrounging at the end of the month to put something on the table, that to, a person is willing to take, I guess, that cut is in the type of food they buy, what they buy, how much they buy, rather than losing their home, because homelessness is in many people's mind not an option, right? They'll try everything,
Yep.
and whether that be, rely on family, friends. But yeah, I think that obviously our economic circumstances have gotten into a very dire state. I was looking at some of the Canadian poverty reduction. They put out a report every year on the numbers, and income to cost of living, um, that variation is just huge. I think all of us are impacted, obviously, by the cost of everything, whether that be the groceries or any other items that we're buying, and it's going to impact people in deep core housing need and that have lower incomes than anyone else, quite
I think you're
frankly.
right. But housing and housing inaffordability and life inaffordability is an issue for absolutely everybody, but it's most acute in a portion of the population that is most at need. And I
Yeah.
do think that the federal government and the provincial government and the regional government that all have responsibility for that segment of society from a social spending standpoint. Particularly, the federal government has really exited or dramatically reduced its commitment to housing
Mhm.
in that segment, and I think it's caused a lot of these problems. And the problems didn't come to obviousness right away. It took a decade or so for it to happen. But
Mhm.
I think that their lack of federal involvement in social housing has
Yeah.
caused the problem. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I think, the punting of responsibility has been ongoing for decades for sure. But if you look at the actual data and who did the investments in purpose-built rental, cooperative housing, right? At least given the mortgages to co-ops, again, social housing, community housing. It was the federal government who stepped up, right? The provinces have always been the ones who provide the wraparound services. So they're usually the service providers, right? So those support mechanisms so that people remain housed, right? And since, again, obviously when they divested in that space, it's had a huge impact on our communities, especially, Mississauga and the region of Peel astronomically has grown over the last 30, 40 years, right? A lot of the housing that was built was, again, single family homes, large urban sprawl. It's just so textbook across the country, and we're not the only community that has had this impact. It's a growing
But it's very
issue.
profound here, I think, because of the
Yeah.
growth. I was part of an organization, it was a decade ago called Fair Share for Peel,
Hmm.
that was arguing that the per capita funding that Peel got was dramatically less than more established communities because the funding was based on censuses taken 10 years previous, and
Hmm.
that it didn't catch up. And I think the statistic at the time, and this is an old number, but it was something like 17 years wait to get into social housing.
Oh, it's now closer probably to 30, I would have to say.
30-year
Yeah.
wait,
Yeah.
which is,
Yeah. I
people don't wait.
yeah.
They do something else.
Yeah, this is it, right? There's two things that you brought up, I think, which is really poignant, and especially as we enter this last few weeks before the election, and um, the metamorphosis group that was created during the possible dissolution of the region of Peel. And, for people who are listening to this who really don't know much about what jurisdiction does what, The region of Peel is the service manager, so most of the provincial funding and federal funding for programs and services, as well as housing, homelessness, public health, emergency services, and even some of the funding for schools as well, funnels through the region, right, and not the city. So I think it's important to note that. The second thing is that when that was happening, the possible dissolution, there obviously, was a lot of conversations about the impact on the cities that would cause, and cause, quite frankly, a lot of chaos with folks at the region as well as services. So Metamorphosis came together to sort of say, hey, don't forget about us services that are serving people throughout your communities. We matter too, right, in this conversation. And they were meeting with sort of like that dissolution panel that was created by the province. And as we know, there was sort of a 180 on that mandate, and the region is going to remain whole, at least for the short term, as we know. Although there were some changes, but I could have that conversation another time. But anyways, Metamorphosis has sort of pivoted and have gone back to the fair share, sort of the fair and equitable Peel. And this week, we are going to be releasing some updated data, Brian, around the shortfalls with respects to funding for the region compared to other cities throughout the province. And it won't be a surprise to you that the region has always been, receiving less and not getting their fair share of funding from the province. But the data will even show, I guess, the extent of the issue. And so we at Metamorphosis are calling for counselors to do a bit of that advocacy around getting our fair share for programs and services, because even when we're talking to citizens, everyone is saying my taxes, don't want my taxes to go up. Rightly so, ratepayers, property owners don't want to see their taxes go up. But we do know two things, one of which is that the municipalities in the region rely heavily on property taxes, right? In order for them to fund the programs and services that we need, the parks, the emergency services, affordable housing, supports for people experiencing homelessness and public health. But at the same time, if the province is underfunding the region, that could have a tremendous impact, not only on service delivery, but also on ratepayers, the amount they pay for the region taxes, right? And quite honestly, I think the region has reached their limit with respect to how much they can expect the ratepayer and the property owner to be taxed, because the councillors are saying no more, right? So where do we go from here? The only thing that we can do is bring up that fair share conversation again, because it's just
but we've been talking about it for 20, 25 years.
Yeah.
Fair share appeal was established, I don't know, in the
I
early
remember
2000s.
I was part of that too. Yeah, I know.
And it hasn't had an impact. So why hasn't it had an impact? I'm going to leave you with that question, because we're going to take a break for some messages. You can think about that while we're taking a commercial break. Why haven't we had the desired impact on the provincial government to get the funding that we deserve? We'll be back in 2 minutes with Michelle Bilek talking about a fair share for Peel, about housing and social housing and affordable housing and food insecurity. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes.
You'll be seeing.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Michelle Bilek. She is very active in the Mississauga Peel community on homelessness issues, on housing issues, on fair share for Peel, on food insecurity. She's run for the NDP a couple of times. She's been very active in civic issues. I've had the privilege of interviewing her previously on housing issues, and today we're talking primarily about food insecurity, but they're really interconnected. Michelle, what's the best way to solve this problem? The federal government, we talked about, sort of removed itself from social housing, affordable housing, back, in the 1990s when Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien dramatically reduced program spending because of the deficits that we had and the debt that we had at the time. And then last August, the current prime minister said that the federal government had no role or not a primary responsibility for housing. He sort of switched course, and in the last budget, it was almost all about housing,
Mhm.
but not about a lot about social housing. Um, and what do you think the solution is?
Mhm. That's a really good question. I think most of the people that are doing this work in this space say there isn't just one solution, right? I think I think it's so intersectional and dynamic that has gotten us to this place, right? There's no question that it would foundationally it would be housing needs to be at least affordable, accessible, and appropriate to people. That's a good place to start, right? And so we have seen during this budget the federal government double down on the infrastructure side of things, right? So we are seeing some money obviously go to the private sector, some money actually, which was very eye-opening, and I was happy about it, going to the cooperatives in order to start that movement up again throughout the country. But housing is, from conception to move-ins, right? We're talking anywhere from in a 3 to 5 to 7 year period before housing is actually developed. Um, and even if we're even looking at other forms of various forms of housing, it's still going to take some time to do that. And so in the interim, what do we do? The interim is around solutions is providing people with the income they need in order to at least remain housed, in order to at least have access to, food, ensure that their children, can get to and from school, and that their families are, having some sort of form of security. So that it's sort of those two things that we've been working on the advocacy side for sure, is getting, at the federal level we were working with the federal government and also researchers such as Steve Pomeroy and Carolyn Weitzman and Mary. And I know that you've had Carolyn on around some sort of form of a housing benefit as well, right? That would be sort of an essential need currently. It wouldn't necessarily be something that would have to continue, but when people are in such dire crisis, when we have our shelters 400 plus capacity, there's no more room at the inns either, right? Like we have nowhere for people to go, right? We have growing number of encampments across the region, and we're just trying to keep people safe at this point. But when I look at the data, and I know that 90,000 people in the region of Peel are in deep core housing need, and 75% of those people are literally on the cusp of homelessness. This is the alarm bells are sounding off, right? And so as we go to the mayors, we have to be thinking about both of those things. Certainly the housing side, right? For sure. But building more condominiums that are $1 million, or you look at the rental market and 2,400, who in the heck can afford that when they're on Ontario Works, or even a disability, they have a disability. What are they going to do? Where are they going to live? Right? This is just not going to work for our community. So we have to start thinking a little bit more innovatively. And I've been pitching some ideas to the mayor candidates that folks haven't really talked about. I mean, you hear some of the platforms from the other candidates around housing, and quite honestly, they're just pitching the things that they have to do if they want to get provincial or federal funding. Like those are the things you got to do. If you want funding from us, you have to, implement these processes. And so, yes, that's essential. But we haven't talked about, how are we going to build community housing? How are we going to build deeply affordable? How are we going to have better relationships with the region, support the region in building those social housing, affordable housing, and also work with co-ops too. So, all these things impact a person's daily life. So here we are, food banks, yes, astronomical level. But if you talk to Megan at the food bank, she'll sit there and say, the panacea of that is affordability across the board, but predominantly housing affordability.
So I'll give you a couple of suggestions if I could. I think that
Mhm.
number one, there has been a lot of criticism about building $1 million condos. But I think that's misplaced. Pre-construction condo sales are down 71% in the last quarter. And so, the condominiums aren't being built. And it's not that they're not being built because developers don't want to build them. It's because it's uneconomic, because prices haven't gone up appropriately, given the cost of construction, the cost of interest, and the time period it takes to get a project approved. And so this problem is going to get worse. And so people that criticize the development of condominiums, I think, are completely misplaced, because we need more supply, basic supply and demand. If you don't have the supply, people do need a place to live. They'll bid up the price of that, and it becomes unaffordable. So I think that we need more places. In addition, the vast majority of people, and some people criticize this, but the vast majority of condominiums that have been built in Mississauga and in Toronto are rented out. So they are rental properties because it's investors that buy. And then people say, well, we shouldn't allow investors to buy. The reality of the development process is that you need 75 to 80% of all of your condominiums sold before you can start construction, because that's what the banks demand you get. Otherwise, you can't build. And so you need those investors. Some of it will be owner occupiers that then buy the condos, but that's not close to a majority. It's, in the 20 to 30% range. And so you need all those investors that are going to come in and buy those condos. They're going to buy those condos and then try to sell them once the condominium is built, or more than likely rent it out. And so that's where we've gotten the increase in rental stock of late. It's going to be investors. So it's not landlords that are building huge apartment buildings. It's one-off investors in condominium after condominium that ends up renting it out. So I think that's the basic level of supply and demand. That said, I think we need to have the more affordable housing, and I think inclusionary zoning does that. And I think it needs to be an incentive, because if you don't have inclusionary zoning where you're selling or renting a certain amount of your apartments or condos at something less than market rates, typically 80 or 70% of market rates, if you do that as a mandate, the developer still needs to make the same amount of money because the banker demands that and the investors demand that. And so therefore, if you don't give them the incentive to provide that more affordable space, they'll just pass it on, which means that the price for the condos for everyone else is more expensive. And so therefore, young people and renters that are wanting to move in are paying this tax for the inclusionary zoning, more affordable housing. But what's happened in most cities, not in Toronto, not Mississauga, but in most cities, what they've done is they've given extra density, extra height as compensation for providing that inclusionary zoning. So one of the proposals that I've made is increase the density around major transit areas by 20% and give half of that as affordable housing. So you're incentivizing the developer to provide some more affordable housing. I think there's a couple of benefits of that. Number one, it's going to get built more quickly. Number two, mixed income housing works best. To build a dedicated building that is all social housing ends up creating ghettos.
And co-ops are like that. They're not all, they're rent geared to income housing, and there are a certain number of them are for people who are, let's say, on social assistance disability, but there's also market units, but a bit low.
But that mixture is what people actually want to live in. They don't want to live in a ghetto. And so I think,
Brian,
and then the other thing is close to transit, because what people typically do is they take a look at their housing costs and their transportation costs. And that's what they've got to, have a certain amount of income to afford, because they got to get to a job. And if you provide that housing far away from transit and transportation, then they need a car. And the car plus the car insurance plus all the gasoline, et cetera, goes into that pricing. And so it's got to be close to transit. And so therefore it is greater height, greater density, near transit with inclusionary zoning. That is an incentive, not a tax on developers to provide. And it's done in a mixed income kind of methodology, I think is the key. And then one more thing, in Hamilton, what they're doing right now, and across Ontario in some places, is they're taking away development fees for developments less than $400,000, or a rent that would be equivalent to a $400,000 rent. Development fees are a tax on the new. tax on the
Mhm.
young, tax on immigrants, tax on people that can least afford it. And I think it's wrong. And I think that it should be taken off of everything. And people don't want to do it, but then we're not going to build. And so therefore you're not going to get it anyway. But at least reduce it or eliminate it on condominiums or rental apartments at less than a certain dollar figure. And I'd recommend $400,000 or $500,000. And people
Nice.
say, oh, well, there aren't any things that are less than $500,000. No, you know what? If you take development fees off of anything below $500,000, you'll find a lot of condominiums that are being sold for $600,000, $700,000 that the developer prices at $499. They're going to get under the $500,000 because they'll save $100,000 plus in development fees, and they'll be able to build something that is what people can afford. Developer after developer tells me that today people aren't building and people aren't buying what they want to live in. Regrettably, they're buying what they can afford. They're renting what
Mhm.
they can afford. That's what you need to do.
Mhm.
So those
Mhm.
are 3 ideas for you.
Yeah, that's no, it's all really good. Sorry. It's everything you said is bang on. But my mindset is always going towards the the deeply affordable, right? You talked to Carolyn, right? And she did the research with the University of British Columbia, right? So they have the heart needs assessment tools, right? Well, the heart assessment tools, right? And that data is publicly available. They have that data for the region of Peel, right? And so what it does is actually show us what is the need. What is the need in the region of Peel? Is it single unit, 1 bedroom units? Is it family units? What is the price range that people need? Like, they have a comprehensive scope of data. So they have the needs assessment tool, right? They also have uh, a land assessment tool. So what land is available? What governments own what parcels of land that we can negotiate, right, and utilize for housing in the community, right? And then also there's an acquisition tool within that as well, right? So what properties that are already standing are available for a municipality or a region to access, right? So I mean, this data is available, and I always say, look to the data for solutions, right? If you don't know the need, that, like, who are you building for, right? It's I think that's really important to note. But also, here we are in probably most Western societies, I would have to say, where housing is on the back of developers, right? And of course, it has become an economic form of value, right? Whereas you look at, and other countries like Sweden and many others, it's the government that owns the land and they rent it out, right? So the government is the landlord, right? Which again keeps finances low. But in those cases, this has been something that they've done decade upon decade. But we're in a completely different conundrum here, right? I think that there's what I'm seeing is there's a lack of anything on the affordable side for people, working poor people who have families, right? But 1 bedroom unit isn't going to cut it for someone who is like a single family mom or a single family dad.
I agree, but
Or,
what's the solution?
yeah.
You've talked about Carolyn Weitzman and her analysis,
Mhm.
um, and there's no question that need. I'm asking, what's the solution? The government is not going to build, St. Jamestown's type of developments.
Yeah.
So what's
Well,
the solution?
there's a couple of things I think that Toronto is doing, which is a huge start, that we don't even have here, although there's many in Toronto. Um, Community, right? I've talked about a whole of government approach, right, Brian? So everybody has to be at the table discussing solution making when it comes to these critical issues. Because
So one of
we're
the things, one of the things that Olivia Chow, the mayor of Toronto, is doing is private-public partnerships
Mhm.
along transit nodes. And so she's
Mhm.
going to developers on the Golden Mile in Scarborough,
Mhm.
where, there didn't used to be much height and density. And she's taking city land, a parking authority land, and she's doing a development, private-public partnership with a developer, where the developer gets height and gets density that they want, that people want because they want to live there for market housing close to transit. But she's saying, but I want you to build another tower, or, half of your tower or something like this that is deeply affordable.
Mhm.
That's the kind of working with the private sector.
You got it.
But it's it's developing greater height and density around transit nodes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, they also have numerous community land trusts, right? So this is where the community can step up, right? They have community bonds. They have social bonds through the municipality, right? To bring in equity for just from community. So community feels that they're investing in their own community. They don't have any, a lot of people want solutions. Everybody does. Everybody doesn't know who to turn to or how to help, right? And so these are some other forms that Toronto is doing that seems to be something that we haven't even considered here, right? To bring community together. Land trusts, the property, the land remains affordable in perpetuity, right?
But when
the
when
trust rents
community
it out.
when
Yeah.
communities get together to do that, too often the neighbors object. And there's developments that you're aware of, undoubtedly, that I'm aware of, where you do have affordable, deeply affordable housing that's all built together, and the community gets up in arms and objects to it. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. Oh, actually, I would sort of argue with that because it's, when cooperatives, there's many cooperatives. So a lot of people don't even know they are cooperatives across a lot. There's quite a few in the Erin Mills area, for example. And people wouldn't even know. They look just like townhouse complex, right? But they're cooperatives, and they've sort of just become part of the community. I think most people know that mixed residential areas are the way to go. That's
No
another
question.
thing, though, Brian. I've had conversations with folks at the region too about, about how do we work with community better? How do we consult, right? Some work that I was doing in the city of Hamilton, it took quite a while, but it got them in a place where they created a systemic policy across the whole entire city and municipality of Hamilton around community engagement, right? So they created a community engagement policy, and that involved community from the start to be part of those discussions and the creation of this policy. We don't have anything like that here, right? It's very people feel that they come to meetings if they can. Sometimes the meetings are held at times and spaces that aren't accessible to everybody. They just don't feel heard, that the decisions have already been made. They haven't been part of those conversations since its inception. And I know that we're sort of held and noosed by the province around development projects, because even if the municipality vetoed it, they can go to the province. The province can allow it to happen, right? Based on, if it was community feedback. But at least I think we have to do a better job on the engagement side of things, right? So yes, one up consultations, but how do we also partner with communities, right? How can they feel involved in that project? How can we have a thorough communication strategy for people, so that they see the benefit of bringing everybody in, right? not just one demographic of individuals, right? And I think those meaningful conversations have to be had more often, and it certainly does take time and energy. But if we had a policy that everybody would agree to, right? That would be maybe a good place to start, right?
Michelle,
you're always going to have pushback. Change is not comfortable.
I agree with you completely.
Yeah.
But let's be honest, only 20% of the people are coming out to vote, let alone come to community meetings. It seems that, lots of people talk about the desire for community involvement and democracy, but it's almost as if the elite does almost everything they can to stymie democracy and other people's votes. They want their point of view presented, but they don't want everyone else's point of view presented. This housing first, more homes, Mississauga, or whatever it was, debate is a perfect example. The executive director is a former Liberal staffer. She was all over the news a year ago or 9 months ago in regards to this fourplex policy. So she's clearly taken a very partisan point of view. She only invited people that agreed with her point of view. She excluded everyone else. Here's an organization that's saying we want to solve problems for everybody. We want more community consultation, but we only want the people that agree with us and you know, our own point of view, and everyone else. And she makes fun of them. She was quoted in the newspaper of saying, if people want to build birdhouses, everyone complains. You know what? That's not the truth. And yet she's belittling people that have a different point of view from hers. That's not democracy. That's the opposite of democracy.
Agree. Yep. Yeah, yeah. I completely agree. I mean, we could certainly talk about that debate. But yeah, I think that's obviously a huge issue. During all elections, right? So getting people out and feeling that they're a part of solution making.
But if you
and that
don't include the people
counts.
in the conversation,
yeah, for
you know,
sure.
there were signs all over Mississauga saying, you know, become a candidate. All over Mississauga, the city of Mississauga was sponsoring these display signs saying, become a candidate. And then they did everything they could to exclude everything but the existing city councillors afterwards. Anyway, I
agree with you. That was certainly one debate that ended up becoming more of a political platform for certain candidates, for sure, especially Liberal candidates. Yeah. I'll just leave it at that.
It's wrong, but it's also the other ones that, you know, said they only had room for 6 people, or, you know, they didn't wait to the end of nominations before they decided who they were going to invite. I think that, you know what, there's a 19-year-old Muslim young lady that is incredibly articulate that's running. And we don't have, you know, we have 21% turnout on average. Turnout for young people is abysmal. It's less than 5%, some people think. Why wouldn't you have someone like that in a debate so that people can see that they have a role? There's a 30-year-old alternative musician that is funny and incredible and charismatic. He could motivate people to come out. And instead, what we're doing is we're leaving it to people that look like me. It's the more well-to-do homeowners that are the people that are excluding everyone else from having a voice. And I just think it's wrong. Anyway, we got to take a break for some messages. We're going to come back in 2 minutes. I'm going to ask you about this fourplex idea when we come back. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Michelle Bilek. She is a home security, food security, poverty action-oriented individual. Been very involved in Peel and Mississauga society. She's run for the NDP. She's been very involved in Fair Share Peel and other organizations that are really advocating for the less advantaged in our society. And I think you've done an incredible job, Michelle, over the years in raising people's awareness and arguing and advocating for your points of view. And so it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. Let me ask you about this one issue that sort of came up, because I think it is, you know, I hate this word, but I think it's appropriate. It's almost a woke issue. And this is this fourplex as of right. And let me explain, if I could, and see how you respond. So, you know, a year ago, the province mandated triplexes as of right. And there was very little, if any, take up. And then the federal government came along and said, if you want the infrastructure money, you're going to have to allow fourplexes as of right. And some cities have stood up, Oakville, Windsor, and said, you know, it's not appropriate for all of our suburban areas. It may be appropriate in some areas, but it's not appropriate for all of the areas. And the Liberal Party in Queen's Park actually put forward a policy saying, because the triplexes weren't enough to take up, we want to approve, as of right, you can build 4 stories. And, you know, thankfully it was defeated. I think that these fourplexes don't make sense. And I think it's almost a woke kind of a strategy to separate us into different camps. Because number one, the triplexes had very little take up. So they're not going to get built. Number two, if they were ever built, there's been no study of, do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the road system? Are we willing to do the driveways? So we don't know whether the sewage and water can absorb 4 times as much people and units on an area. And it's just not people, it's the number of toilets, the number of washrooms, the number of kitchens, et cetera, that has to be taken into account. Even if the number of people don't go up by 4, if the units go up by 4, that ends up by dramatically increasing the toll on infrastructure. Our streets, are we going to allow 4 times as many cars in every driveway? Are we going to, because that's probably impossible, going to allow street parking where the vast majority of Mississauga doesn't allow street parking because the emergency vehicles and other traffic can't get along? Do we want to live in that kind of environment? If the triplexes didn't take up, and the Liberal Party thinks that to take up 4plexes, you got to allow 4 stories, do we actually want houses that are currently 1 and 2 stories to be 4 stories as of right in our neighborhoods? And I think that the proposal makes a ton of sense in some areas close to transit, but it makes 0 sense everywhere. And as I've talked to some big proponents of this, they've said, well, don't worry, Brian, because it's not actually going to get built. Well, if it's not going to get built, why argue for it? Like, it's stupid. It said, I want to do this 4plexes, but don't worry, it's not going to actually impact the streets and the driveways and the backyards. You got to split a backyard into 4 different yards. Like, they say, don't worry, it's not going to happen because it's not going to happen. It's not going to get built. Well, if it's not going to get built, then why make such a big deal about it? It ends up being this woke thing you argue about, but in reality, it's not going to solve anything. And it takes all of your time to argue about it. What do you think?
Yeah. To be honest with you, I think that allowing or mandating 4plexes for like the half funding, right? For example, from the federal government, as a stipulation to receive funding. I think that's it's just language, and you're right. And you're right. The opportunity is there for people, developers, if they'll develop it, but they more likely will not do that because of pushback, right? Second thing, I think that there are literally 4plexes anyways existing in many areas. You could consider some of the townhouses that are just as high as a 4plex would be, right? To be 4plexes, low-rise townhouses, four stories, right? So there is sort of that type of housing already sort of existing anyways
townhouse developments make sense, but you see where
areas,
townhouses,
right?
They went and got separate zoning. They made sure they had the infrastructure. They made
Yeah.
sure they had the proper access and egress, and they're often at major intersections close to transit.
Yeah, and low rise. That's what I'm in right now is a low rise, right? A 4-story low rise, right? In a very sort of what I would say single family home neighborhood, to be honest with you. So I think it really was more around getting municipalities to think differently when it comes to zoning, as well as issues around developmental charges, many other sort of stipulations under that funding. And that funding in particular, to be honest with you, Brian, I don't think it's going to build 1 iota unit whatsoever. I think the half funding is predominantly focused on processes, right? So streamlining processes at the municipal level, again, around zoning, around developmental charges, around height restrictions, around shadowing, around parking, those types of things. So you're going to see more bureaucrats, right? Changing the way they do things at the city and regional level. Now it's
more bureaucrats changing the way to do things. Oh, that sounds fantastic. If they did less and accelerated reviews, I would agree with you completely.
I was looking at the funding when I was in Hamilton, so changes to get shovels in the ground, and then also the half funding will do changes in order to expedite move-ins. So that's pretty much predominantly what that funding will be used for. It's not a large component of money. I think Hamilton they received at that time just over $100 million, which isn't very much money. And you think about like the staff that will have to be hired to make those changes. So, sometimes I think some of these announcements are more of like talking points politically than they actually will provide any sort of form of
I don't think,
solution making.
I think it's a bad idea, because if it actually was implemented, it would be catastrophic for our neighborhoods. And the only answer is, well, Brian, it's not going to get actually implemented. And if it's not going to get implemented, then why argue like crazy for it? It's illogical. I don't think people, you know, if you have a party and you're parking on the street, you come get ticketed by the local, police and bylaw officers. I don't think people want to have tons and tons of on-street parking and driveways that have got 4 times as many cars in them everywhere. Some places close to transit, close to major arterials, makes a ton of sense. But I think people moved to Mississauga because they wanted a certain environment, and we have to change. There's no question we have to change, but the change should take place on major arterials and on around transit nodes. And I think that this is a bad idea forced upon us by the federal government, the provincial government, and I think that it's the opposite of everything you argued for, which is more community consultation, more democracy. It's a bribe and or it's an incentive saying you don't get this 25 or 125,000 million dollars unless you do what I want. You got to do it within the next couple of weeks. And so I think that's wrong.
It's not, when you look at the grand scheme of things, it's not a large pot of money anyways. And again, I don't think it's going to build one thing.
Let me ask you another question, if I could. You were at the Port Credit top cut debate, and Carolyn Parrish, a candidate for mayor, described the morass of red tape and bureaucracy and said this in the approval process. And the solution to that was that she would get together once a month with a group of what she called, I think, qualified developers, and figure what the problems were and sort of use her mayor powers to override the system. And I thought that was actually proof positive that the system doesn't work. Because if you've got to get a mayor that's going to insert herself in the process and solve the problems, that says the system doesn't work. And wouldn't it be better to actually fix the system than introduce some political favoritism or social favoritism or whatever that is? Like, the judgment shouldn't be made by one mayor. It should be made by the whole planning process. And if the planning process is broken, fix the planning process. Don't have a mayor come in. It's the old line about, head office coming in to blank on you.
Yep. So you're asking me about strong mayor powers?
No, I'm asking you about, if a mayor thinks that they've got to get involved once a month with their own chosen developers, is that good? Or is that proof that the system doesn't work?
Of course. I mean, if it's her approved friends around the table, I think that's not appropriate, right? But I do believe in sort of like an all community approach when you're addressing these issues. And so, if we're talking about the whole spectrum of housing, for example, we need everybody at the table. We need private developers, we need public developers and not-for-profits, we need co-ops, we need faith communities, we need basically everybody along the whole construction companies. Everybody has to be talking and having those conversations about how are we going to do this better? What needs to be done in order to get things built appropriately for our community, right? And I just don't think that that's happening. I think when I was in Hamilton just recently at the end of last year, those conversations were starting.
Yeah,
and they were initiated by the private development sector, and they brought in everybody, all landowners, all programs and services, the whole spectrum, right, of people who are affected by the housing crisis that is, at our doorstep right now for everybody. So I think that that's a more, I would say, substantial and useful method. And it would be something very different. I think, everybody would be private, public, faith communities who have land. And, again, many other not-for-profits would like to start having those conversations together so that we think about solution making as an all of community approach, and not just, certainly pick out certain developers to work with,
So
to have meaningful conversations. I think maybe folks just haven't considered it. I know some counselors are really, really good at community engagement, but counselors are focused on their community, right? So they might be doing said things that I just mentioned in their own wards, right? But we haven't done it as a sort of a pan-Canadian approach to addressing housing across the city. And maybe that's something that we have to start thinking about, is not just working in our little bubble, but working better together as a city around solution making. And there might be things that one counselor is doing great in their ward that another counselor could also be appropriating and doing in their ward. But are those conversations happening? I don't know. It's it's almost like, here's my little,
My
group of
little fiefdom.
individuals.
That's, I think, part of the
Yeah,
problem is that the counselors think of their own little ward as a fiefdom. We got to take
yeah,
a
but
final break for some messages, and we're going to come back in 2 minutes with Michelle Bilek with some concluding comments. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Michelle Bilek, who is a real advocate for food insecurity, not for it, but against it, and housing affordability and fair share for appeal and a lot of things for people that are more disadvantaged in our society. And I've really loved following her over the years and what she's been arguing for and supporting the advocacy that she plays in the city of Mississauga and the region of Peel. Michelle, this has been a really good conversation about food insecurity and housing. I appreciate that. Let me give you my point of view, and then maybe you can respond. So I think that housing is the big issue in food insecurity, because people think about housing and transportation as 30, 40% of their income. And what I think the statistics say is that when it's above 50, 60% of the income, then food ends up being what people can't afford. And so you've got to get people to be able to have housing and how they get to work, transportation, less than 50% and hopefully 30% of their income, which allows them to do everything else that they need to do. And I think the solution to that is height and density around major transit zones. I don't think it's spread out everywhere in every subdivision, because I don't think it'll happen. Even in downtown Toronto, you've got height and density at Yonge and Eglinton, but a block away, you're back to single family homes. And where you do have some development, frankly, it's people buying up those homes and turning them into monster homes that are still single family rather than fourplexes. You do have some of that, but not a lot of it. And the development that has happening for triplexes or fourplexes ends up being on transit routes. And the reason why is because often the people that want to move into those locations don't have cars or don't want to rely completely on cars, and therefore they need transit. And also the infrastructure isn't there to allow a whole bunch of extra parking, et cetera. And that's what you've seen happen naturally, organically. And so think that it's going to spread out everywhere. Number one, it just hasn't happened yet. Number two, I think is, I don't know whether it's idealistic or naive. I think it's more naive than idealistic. So I think it is around major transit nodes and arterials. And the problem in that regard is people fight like crazy over height. And yet every architect tells me that people don't think about height over maybe 6 stories. They don't notice it. And I'll give you a great example at Dixie and Dundas. And I'm familiar with the area because I'm actually part of a company that has some land there. The maximum within 800 meters of that GO train station is 12 stories. In Vancouver, if you're within 400 meters of a major transit station, the minimum you can build by provincial regulations is 12 stories. So we've got a maximum of 12 stories and they've got a minimum of 12 stories. And I think that if you actually built more housing and you had an incentive where, we'll give you the right to build even more than we otherwise would give you, but you've got to have some of that be inclusionary zoning such that it's affordable. I think that makes a ton of sense. As I mentioned, I'm in the development business right now. The biggest impediment to construction today is interest rates. CMHC is providing low interest rate loans for rental housing, and you've got the GST and HST that have been taken off that. And what you need to do is you need to have a certain amount of affordable, a certain amount of accessible, and a certain amount of environmental. And developers work like crazy to meet those criteria, building exactly the type of housing that I think you would like, and that's going to meet some of these needs to get the benefit of the the lower interest rates. The second biggest risk for a developer is the time it takes to get approval and the risk of getting that approval, such that there's counselors that tell me over and over again, I'm not going to be able to support this. Just go to the OLT because you'll get what you want at the OLT, the Ontario Land Tribunal. So counselors don't have the guts, the political courage to stand up and make the adult decisions and tell their communities this is actually what we need, but they're allowing the OLT to do it. The problem with that is that's another 2 years and another $1 million. And then the OLT passes it. Over 95% of the things that get presented to the OLT end up getting approved and passed. And so they're using the OLT as the adult in the room that's going to actually approve the developments that need to happen. Why not have a system where we admit that around transit zones, we should have higher density, but in exchange for that height and density, we want some things. We want accessible, we want affordable, we want greater amenities, we want some things, and then take it one step further. The third biggest impediment is development fees that are outrageous. They are over $100,000 per unit. They're a tax on our young people and our newcomers. It is the most regressive tax of any tax in our whole taxation system because it's paid for by the people that can least afford it. And then you've got politicians, again, I'm not sure whether they're naive or just whatever, saying, oh, that, you know, the development fees are paid for by the developer. They're not paid for by the developer. The developer passes it on because they need to pass it on because they got to make the set number of profit. You know, you're not going to take it out of the construction workers or the construction companies or the banks or the development profit because the banks demand you make that development profit. Otherwise, they don't want to take over the project and or lend you the money. So the development fees get passed on to the consumer, which means that young people that want to buy that condominium or that townhouse are paying those development fees, or the newcomer or the immigrant or the refugee or the renter that wants to go into housing. So reduce those development fees and say, I'll reduce those development fees for anything under 500,000, but you got to build in the next year. You did those three things. I think you would change the housing crisis situation in Mississauga overnight. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it would certainly expedite building for sure. I think there's also a conversation that has to be had around, around the employment piece, right? The lack of skilled workers and the fact that I think across our country, you know, we've dropped the ball around, around the trades, and trade schools are non-existent anymore. Since I was in high school, that was an option. It's not an option anymore. So again, I think also, you know, when I talk about sort of like an all departmental, all government approach, all community approach, we have to even talk about that as well. Is that we need the manpower.
Michelle,
in order to
there
do
are
these
more
things.
people involved in construction today than ever have been before.
Yeah,
Okay?
which is good. Yeah.
So there are the workers there. The challenge that you've got is, number one, major infrastructure projects like the Eglinton LRT and the Ontario line are you know, crowding out basic construction. They're sopping up those people. And number two, you know, tower development is a lot more efficient than one by one triplexes and fourplexes or single family homes. So, you know, the most efficient, you know, manufactured housing would be the most efficient, but for some reason consumers don't want to move into it. But manufactured housing would be the most efficient. The second most efficient is multifamily residential development. It is. It's more efficient to put 5 more stories at 10 suites a story. That's, you know, 50 homes that people can move in than it ever would be to build 50 single family homes or 10 or, you know, 12 quadplexes.
Yep. Agreed.
Fourplexes, sorry.
Yeah. Agreed.
So bring the time period down for approval by 50%. Be adult and approve things. Don't make them have to go to the OLT. Increase the height and density around major transit zones. Frankly, make those major transit zones all-day, two-way frequent service so that they become even more effective for people. Reduce the development fees, if not eliminate them, for under a certain price figure, and give people the incentive, give developers the incentive to build some affordable housing in exchange for something. Development, greater height, greater development, greater FSI, etc. And realize, you know, the craziest thing is, you know, couple counselors at a debate on last week said that they wanted to have a subway come to Dixie and Dundas. And yet, the subway went to Vaughan because in Vaughan they had 40 to 50-story towers. The subway's going to Steeles and Richmond Hill because at Steeles, Vaughan is building 60-story towers, and in the city of Toronto, 50-story towers. All-day two-way frequent GO train service went to Markham because a new downtown in Markham is being built with 30, 40-story towers. Those councillors didn't tell anyone that you're never going to get a subway with 12-story backs, 12-story maximum limits. Like it's again, it's either naive or they're misrepresenting something. They're just wrong.
Platitude sometimes, yeah. It's wishful thinking. Yeah.
But like wishful thinking is naive, and it's the wrong thing for counselors to stand up on a stage and
right. And it's an election period, my friend. Yeah, we gotta remember.
So you're saying I'm like you're saying Kim Campbell was right when she said election periods aren't the time to actually have good policy debates. I think election periods are the right time to have good policy debates.
I'm right with you. I never was elected. Remember, right? I just ran, so I know how the shenanigans work around election time.
Michelle Bilek, this has been really interesting. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
You too.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Michelle Bilek is one of those people that I've watched over the years, and she's had some really good policy pronouncements and arguments. She's fought hard for the people of Mississauga. We shouldn't quiet these voices down just because they're not an elected official. And too much of what's happened in the last little while in this election debate, more than anything else, is the only people that have been given a voice by too many of the organizations and too much of the media have been the existing city councilors. And yet all those organizations say we want more of a voice. We want to be included. They're talking, both sides of their mouth. They're saying we want a greater voice, but we're only going to allow the city councilors to have a voice. People like Michelle Bilek deserve a voice, deserve to be heard. This young Muslim lady that I mentioned, the young alternative music producer, there are numerous different people that are running. One gentleman that's running on a don't separate Mississauga from Peel, but amalgamate Mississauga and Brampton. It's an interesting argument that should be heard and listened to, and his argument is all about efficiency. So I think that there's interesting voices that have been shut down and shut off, and they shouldn't be. Because if you don't even hear them, how are you possibly ever going to decide whether you want to vote for them or not? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that the city councilors are the only people that are going to get votes because they're the only one you listen to. So the only one that get votes, they're the only one you listen to, because the media and too many of these organizations only allow them to speak. It's wrong. It's not democratic, and it should change. Michelle Bilek, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Brian.
Good night, everybody.